In October of 1932, two men are digging for gold in a narrow canyon in the Pedro Mountains, southwest of Casper, Wyoming. They set a charge against a wall of solid rock. The explosion tears the wall open, and when the dust clears, they're looking into a small hidden room they had no idea was there. Inside that room, sitting upright, knees drawn to its chest, arms folded, is a tiny man, fully formed. Wrinkled skin, a flattened nose, heavy-lidded eyes, a faint, dark smile across the face. And no taller, from the base to the crown of the head, than about 14 inches. That is the story, at least, as it was told by the men who said they found it. And here's the strange thing. That story, on its own, would be easy to dismiss as a tall tale from the mining camps, except it did not stand alone. Because long before those two prospectors ever lit that fuse, the Shoshone people of that region had spoken of exactly this, a race of very small people who lived in the mountains. They called them the Nimerigar, tiny and by some accounts, fierce. So we have two lines here, and they run toward each other from opposite directions in time. On one side, an old indigenous tradition spoken aloud for generations describing little people in the hills. On the other, a physical object pulled out of a Wyoming mountain in the 20th century that seemed to match the description almost too well. And the central question of everything we're going to look at today is this. Was the Pedro Mountain mummy a fraud, a natural medical anomaly misread by untrained eyes? Or was it, somehow, the physical remains of the very thing the Shoshone had been describing all along? To get anywhere near an honest answer, we're going to walk through all of it together. We will look at what the Shoshone actually said about the Nimerigar and how far back that tradition really goes. We will look at the discovery itself, the men who claimed it, and the newspaper coverage that carried the little figure across the country. We will look at the scientific examinations that were reportedly performed on the body, including one at a major university, and what those examinations concluded. And we will confront the strangest twist of all, because whatever that thing was, it is not in any museum today. It vanished, and no one has been able to produce it since. To understand why a 14-inch mummy sitting in a rock chamber sent a genuine shock through Wyoming, and not just a laugh, you have to start where the story really starts. Not in 1932, centuries earlier. With the people who had lived in and around those mountains long before any map called the place Wyoming. The Shoshone are one of the great peoples of the American West, their range stretching across what is now Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. And woven through their oral tradition, alongside countless other stories, is the account of a small people. The name most often written down is Nimerigar, though spellings vary because it was a spoken word first, carried by voice, not ink. According to the tradition, these were little people, standing only a couple of feet high or less, who lived in remote places, in the rocks and the high country. And they were not gentle garden spirits. In several tellings, they were described as aggressive, willing to use tiny bows with poisoned arrows, capable of harming a full-sized person who crossed them. There is even an account within the tradition that when one of their own grew too old or sick to survive, the others would end that life with a blow to the head. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of material that gets flattened and mocked. To an outsider, it is easy to file this under quaint folklore and move on. But that is a mistake, and it is a mistake that matters for everything that follows. Oral tradition, passed from grandparent to grandchild across generations, is a genuine form of historical memory. It is not written down, but that does not make it random invention. Cultures that relied on the spoken word developed astonishing discipline in preserving their stories, because the story was the record. To the Shoshone who carried it, the account of the little people was not entertainment. It was part of how the land was understood, part of the map of what lived where and what to be careful of. And this tradition of a small people is not unique to the Shoshone alone. Variations of little people stories appear across many indigenous nations of North America, from the plains to the woodlands to the desert. That does not prove any of them were real physical beings, but it does tell us something important. This was a widespread, deeply rooted idea, not a one-off local rumor invented on the spot in a mining town. So when something small and human-shaped came out of a Pedro Mountain rock face in 1932, it did not land in an empty silence. It landed on top of centuries of a very specific expectation. If you find yourself drawn to the stories that sit in the gap between recorded history and living memory, the ones the textbooks tend to step around, consider subscribing because those gaps are exactly where this channel lives. So here is what we are going to do from here. We are going to look closely at the discovery itself, at the two men who said they blew open that chamber and what they described. We are going to follow the little mummy out of the mountain and into the newspapers, into a bank vault, and onto the examination table of scientists who actually studied it. We are going to weigh the two competing explanations that have chased this story for 90 years, the hoax on one side and the medical anomaly on the other, and see how each one holds up. And then we are going to face the part that keeps the whole thing open, the disappearance. Because you cannot fully close a case when the single most important piece of evidence has been gone for the better part of a century. Let us go back into that canyon. The men most often named as the discoverers were prospectors working the Pedro Mountains, sometimes given as Cecil Maine and Frank Carr, though even the basic details of who was there vary between retellings, which is itself a warning sign we will come back to. What is consistent across the accounts is the method and the moment. They were after gold. They believed there was a vein running through the rock, so they used dynamite to blast into the mountainside, and instead of opening a mineral vein, the blast opened a cavity, a small room sealed within the rock that by their account showed no obvious way in or out. And sitting in that room was the figure. Picture what it must have been like. The two of them, ears still ringing from the charge, leaning in with a lantern. And there in the settling dust is a tiny seated man, skin the color of dark leather, staring back at them across who knows how many years. According to the account, the little body was in a sitting posture, legs crossed, hands resting in the lap, the head slightly bowed. The skin was intact, the features were distinct, and the whole thing was small enough to be picked up and carried in two hands, roughly 14 inches seated. Some estimates suggested that if it had been standing, the figure would have been perhaps 1.5 feet tall at most. They took it out of the mountain, and this is where the little mummy stops being a private discovery and becomes a public sensation. The object made its way into Casper, and word spread fast. This was the early 1930s, remember? The Great Depression was grinding across the country. People were hungry for wonder, for anything that broke the gray weight of the times. And here was a genuinely bizarre object with a genuinely bizarre backstory. The mummy was reportedly displayed, shown around, and eventually became something of a local attraction. It passed through various hands. At different points, it was said to have been kept in a drugstore, exhibited to the curious, and later held in a bank in Casper, sitting in a safe deposit box like a piece of treasure, which, in a way, it was. Now, the natural reaction, and the correct first reaction, is skepticism. A sideshow-sized mummy appearing in the middle of the Depression, drawing crowds, changing hands? That has all the ingredients of a classic hoax. Fake mummies were a known business in that era. Carnival operators and showmen produced all manner of stitched-together curiosities to separate paying customers from their coins. So, if the story ended with a curiosity in a bank vault and a line of paying gawkers, we would almost certainly file this under fraud and be done. But the story does not end there, because the little mummy did something most sideshow fakes never survive. It got examined. Seriously, by people with the training to tell the difference between a carved fake and actual biological tissue. According to the accounts that come down to us, the mummy was eventually taken east and studied, and at one point it reportedly reached the American Museum of Natural History in New York, one of the most respected scientific institutions in the country. And crucially, it was subjected to X-rays. That is the detail that turns this from a campfire story into a genuine puzzle. Because you can carve a face out of leather and clay. You can stitch skin over a wire armature and fool a crowd in dim light. But you cannot fake an interior skeleton on an X-ray plate. And according to the reports that survive, the X-rays showed something no hoaxer of that era could have manufactured. Inside that tiny body was a skeleton. A complete articulated skeleton with a spine, a rib cage, limbs, and a skull, all in correct anatomical arrangement. There were even reports of damage to the skull and spine, as though the little figure had suffered a violent injury. This was not stuffing and wire. This was, by these accounts, a real body. And here is where it gets harder, not easier. Because the scientists who reportedly examined it did not simply say, yes, this is a tiny adult man. The initial impression that the figure was fully grown came from its appearance, the wrinkled skin, the set of the face, the aged look that made it seem like a little old man frozen in place. And that is the sensation that gripped everyone, a miniature adult. But a body that small, that presented that many anatomical questions, forced a much harder conversation. Was this an adult of a tiny people, exactly as the Shoshone tradition described? Or was it something else entirely, something with a medical explanation that only looked ancient and adult to eyes that wanted to see a legend made flesh? So think about where that leaves us. We have a physical object, not a rumor, examined by real institutions carrying a real skeleton inside it. And we have a centuries-old indigenous tradition describing exactly this kind of being, in exactly these mountains, long before the dynamite ever went off. Two lines from opposite ends of time, pointing at the same impossible little figures sitting in the dust. One of those lines has to be a coincidence, unless neither of them is. And to find out which, we have to look at the two explanations that have fought over this mummy for the better part of a century, and see whether either one can actually account for everything on the table. Let us take the skeptics seriously first, because they have the stronger hand than the mystery lovers usually admit. The most persuasive scientific explanation, and the one that has become the standard account, is that the Pedro Mountain mummy was not a tiny adult at all. It was an infant. Specifically, the leading medical explanation is that the body was that of a baby born with a severe congenital condition called anencephaly, a devastating birth defect in which large portions of the brain and skull failed to develop. Infants with this condition are rarely born alive and do not survive. And here's the key point for our story. Anencephaly produces a very particular appearance. The malformation of the head, the sunken features, the unusual proportions of the face can give a newborn an aged, adult-like look. A wizened, wrinkled, old man appearance on a tiny body. Do you see how neatly that fits? Everything that made the mummy so uncanny, the little old man who seemed both ancient and infant-sized, is exactly what you would expect from an anencephalic newborn, naturally mummified in the dry conditions of a rock cavity. The small size is explained. The adult-seeming face is explained. The complete skeleton on the X-ray is explained, because it was a real baby. And there are reports that later examinations of the mummy, or of a similar specimen from the same region, concluded exactly this: that what looked like a tiny ancient man was, in medical reality, the preserved body of a deformed infant, likely of indigenous origin, placed or buried in that setting long ago. On that reading, the entire legend of the Nimerigar becomes not evidence of little people, but a poignant misunderstanding, layered over the tragic remains of infants who died from birth defects that people of the time had no way to explain. That is a strong argument. Honestly, it is. It uses real medicine, it accounts for the appearance, and it does not require anything supernatural or fantastical. If I had to bet, and I am telling you this plainly, the anencephaly explanation is the single most likely answer for what that specific body actually was. But not so fast, because it is not the clean, closed case it first appears to be. There are details that the tidy medical explanation strains to hold. First, there is the reported condition of the body as a fully proportioned figure. The accounts describe a seated, cross-legged posture, arms and hands arranged with intention, a body that read to observers not as a malformed newborn, but as a small, complete adult in a deliberate resting position. An anencephalic infant has severe cranial malformation, yet witnesses described a nose, a mouth, a set of features that formed a recognizable, if uncanny, little face, and a full head. That does not sit perfectly comfortably with the most severe forms of the condition. Second, there's the matter of the teeth. Some accounts of the examination reported that the figure appeared to have a full set of teeth, which would be extraordinary in a newborn and would point instead toward a body that had actually aged. Now, I want to flag honestly that these reported details are exactly the kind that get exaggerated in retelling, and we cannot fully verify each one at this distance. But if even some of them are accurate, they complicate the infant explanation. And there is a third problem, larger than any single anatomical detail. There was reportedly more than one, Over the years, accounts surfaced of other tiny mummies found in the same general region of Wyoming, including a second small figure sometimes described alongside the first. If the Pedro Mountain mummy were a unique medical tragedy, a one-in-a-million anomaly, that would be one thing, but a pattern of small mummified bodies turning up in the same mountains is harder to wave away, and it lines up uncomfortably well with a tradition that spoke not of a single unfortunate individual, but of a whole people. So here is where the skeptic and the believer both have to stop and be honest. The anencephaly explanation almost certainly accounts for the biology of at least one of these bodies. But it does not, on its own, explain why the Shoshone had a detailed, specific tradition of little people in exactly these mountains, centuries before anyone blasted open that chamber. And this is the part I do not want you to lose. The medical explanation answers what the object was. It does not answer where the story came from, because remember the sequence. The tradition came first. The little people were described long before the dynamite. So even if every tiny mummy ever found in Wyoming turns out to be a deformed infant, we are still left with a genuine question. How did a people arrive at such a specific belief in little beings living in these hills? And why did the ground keep producing objects that matched? There is a way to answer that, and it is the reasonable one. It is entirely possible that over long spans of time, the Shoshone and their ancestors did encounter the naturally mummified remains of such infants in caves and rock shelters, and that those encounters, mysterious and unexplained, became woven into and helped shape the tradition of the little people. On that view, the legend and the mummies are connected, but not in the way the sensational version wants. The bodies did not prove the legend. The bodies may have helped inspire it. That is a subtler relationship, and it is far more interesting than either a simple hoax or a fantasy of hidden tiny men. But we still have not dealt with the single strangest fact in this entire case. Set aside the biology for a moment, because there is a piece missing from every attempt to close this, and it is the piece that keeps the door open no matter which explanation you prefer. The mummy is gone. That is the twist that turns a solvable medical puzzle into a permanent open question. The Pedro Mountain mummy, the actual physical object at the center of everything, has not been seen in public for decades. The trail runs cold sometime around the middle of the 20th century. By various accounts, the little figure passed through the hands of a Casper businessman and was kept, for a time, in that safe deposit box, shown to the curious now and then. And then, at some point, the object simply left the record. It was reportedly last known to be in the possession of a private individual, and after that, nothing. No confirmed museum holds it, no verified location. It has become, in effect, a missing person, a body that was studied, X-rayed, discussed, and photographed, and then quietly slipped out of the world. Now put every thread we have gathered onto the table at once, and look at how they line up. Line 1. The Shoshone tradition, ancient and specific, describing a small people in these exact mountains, carried by voice across generations. Line 2. The physical discovery, a real body with a real internal skeleton, confirmed by X-ray at a serious institution, small enough to hold in two hands, wearing the face of a little old man. And running underneath both of them, the most likely biological explanation, that at least one of these bodies was a naturally mummified anencephalic infant, an explanation that is medically sound and yet cannot fully account for the depth and age of the tradition that predicted it. 3 kinds of evidence, and each one tells a different part of the story: the spoken memory of a people, the material object under an X-ray beam, and the reasoning of modern medicine trying to make sense of both. No single one of them closes the case alone. And here is the physical reality that keeps the whole thing alive. Because the object vanished, the most important tests were never finished. We live now in an age of DNA analysis, of high-resolution imaging, of dating methods that did not exist in 1932. A single modern examination of that little body could, in principle, settle almost everything. It could tell us the age at death, whether infant or adult. It could confirm or rule out anencephaly beyond argument. It could tell us how old the remains truly were, and whether they belonged to a known population or to something genuinely unexpected. Every question that has hung over this case for 90 years could be answered by the very object we no longer have. That is what makes the disappearance so maddening. The answer was real. It was solid. It sat in a bank vault in Wyoming, and then it was allowed to slip away, taking its answers with it. Somewhere, perhaps, in a forgotten box, in an attic, in a private collection whose owner has no idea what they hold, the little man may still be sitting, knees drawn up, waiting. But the object is not really where this story ends, because what it asks of us, in the end, is not just what was that body. It is how we treat the memory of people who told us something long before we were willing to listen. Think about what we actually have here, stripped of the sideshow and the sensation. We have a people who, for generations, said there were little ones in these mountains, and we have a ground that, again and again, gave up small mummified bodies that made outsiders stop and stare. The easy path, the one taken for most of a century, was to split those two things apart, to call the tradition a superstition and the mummy a medical curiosity, and to let them sit in separate boxes. But the harder, truer possibility is that they were connected all along. That the Shoshone were not inventing fantasies, they were remembering encounters with something real and strange in the rocks, and preserving that memory in the only archive they had, the spoken word, long after the details of any single discovery had faded. The legend, in that light, is not the opposite of the evidence. It may be the oldest evidence we have. And that is the quiet lesson underneath the whole tale. History is not only what got written down by the people who happened to be holding the pen. There is another record, carried in voices, older and often deeper than the documents, and we ignore it at the cost of misunderstanding our own past. The Pedro Mountain mummy sits at the exact seam where those two records meet, and it refuses to let us pretend the seam is not there. Not proven, no, but not disproven either. And absence of proof, as we keep learning, is not the same thing as proof of absence. There is a small, sharp weight to it that stays with me. A body that could have answered everything, studied, x-rayed, and then let slip through our fingers into silence, while the story it belonged to had been kept alive, without any body at all, for hundreds of years by people we long refused to take seriously. And now look again at that image we started with. Two prospectors, ears ringing, leaning into a blown-open chamber with a lantern, finding a tiny old man staring back at them. For a long time, that was told as a spooky curiosity, a Depression-era oddity. But knowing everything we now know, look at it again. That was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment two worlds collided, the written world of science meeting the far older spoken world that had been describing this exact thing all along. So let me leave you with a real question, not a rhetorical one. Is there a story where you come from? Something the elders or the old-timers always insisted was true, that the official version brushed aside as legend, only for something later to make you wonder if they knew more than anyone gave them credit for? I would genuinely like to hear it. Tell me in the comments, and tell me whether you think the little man was an infant, a hoax, or something we have not properly named yet. I really do want to read your answers to that, because the conversation underneath these videos is half the reason I keep making them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones that live in the gap between the archive and the memory, then subscribe, because there are stranger and quieter ones still coming. If it held you all the way to the end, a like genuinely helps other people find their way to it, and that is not a small thing. Thank you for sitting with this one with me. Keep listening to the old stories the maps left out, and I will see you in the next one.